Well, we want to join with Congressman Kevin McCarthy here. Thank you so much for joining us here in studio. Thanks for your time today. I want to begin by asking you, the governor recently announced the end of high-speed rail, keeping only the Central Valley portion from Merced to Bakersfield. You seized on that, introducing legislation that would repurpose funding for high-speed rail to water infrastructure projects in our state to the tune of $3.5 billion. But doesn't the president want that money back after Gavin Newsom made that announcement? The president said he wants to take back that federal money. Will that happen?
Yes, the president does want to take it back, and the president's right to take it back. I never supported high-speed rail. I never thought, one, it wasn't high-speed, two, the business plan was wrong, and three, you'd have to subsidize all the riders. Now, back in 2010, prior to the Republicans taking the majority in the House, the Democrats appropriated $3 billion for California high-speed rail. There's roughly a little less than $1 billion left of that. But it's just like any other contract. If California is not building it, they don't need this money. But I believe in a very limited government, but one thing government should do is infrastructure. Now, the federal government was going to provide this to California for building of infrastructure. I think one of the greatest needs California has is water infrastructure. We're very fortunate not to have a drought this year, but we know a drought is coming in the future. And too much of our water goes directly out to the ocean. So what I want to do is utilize that money for the greatest return on the investment and use it for part of the element of a bill I had passed in the future called the WIN Act, where we can build greater water storage for everyone in California. I think that's a great use of the money and would keep the money in California and would be the right thing to do for the future.
But wouldn't it be the right thing for voters to decide on that? I mean, in 2008, they essentially voted for that money to be spent on high-speed rail. Should this go through Congress, or should this go back before the voters to decide?
Well, this is separate money from what the voters voted on. The voters voted on a bond for California money, for the California money, and that money should not be used. That should be sent back. This is money that was appropriated by Congress when the Democrats were in the majority, and it was set aside from transportation to be used just in this element if California met certain criteria. But as we're seeing, California is not meeting that criteria, so you shouldn't throw more money after a bad project. So what I'm believing is, instead of California losing this money, why don't we invest in water infrastructure? The president agrees that California needs a better water infrastructure. I think most all Californians agree with this, and I think it's a good return on the investment of where we should spend the money.
And you don't think the president's going to challenge you on this after that tweet saying we're going to get that money back?
No, I think we get it back, but the federal government has already allocated this money to be spent. So I think if government should spend it on infrastructure, a good place that it should be spent is in California water infrastructure.
All right, I want to stay on state business. Before I ask you about the border wall and the president's emergency declaration, there's actually some news on that just in the last few moments. The governor, though, recently announced the end of the death penalty in our state. Some 700 inmates are on death row. 25 of those cases, convictions from here in Kern County. The governor called the process a failure, a waste of taxpayer dollars. Was that the right way to handle the issue, and do you support the death penalty and the current process?
That is the wrong way for the governor to handle it. First of all, the governor promised prior to running for governor that he'd listen to the voters. The voters have actually made a statement on this just in the last 7 years twice. In 2016, when they voted on speeding up the process of a death penalty for actually to see if you have a challenge to the death penalty. But the voters have upheld in California a number of times. We believe in the death penalty. I personally believe in this death penalty. And the governor does not have the power among himself just to nullify this. That is a real problem. And I think in the end, the governor will be challenged on this and the governor will lose.
What about the process? I mean, the last time that an inmate was put to death here in California was 2006. And all these inmates on death row statistically will die there of natural causes. Only some 4% are actually executed. Is this a waste of taxpayer dollars, putting these families through decades of having to relive the case without any real closure? I mean, is there a better way? Perhaps Congress could be involved in this process?
Well, you got the 10th Amendment and states' rights, and this is one thing the states decide upon individually. You find a number of times the number of appeals that go forward. That's why in 2016, the California voters took up the last initiative on this to kind of solve this problem, where you can still, if a jury decides upon a death penalty And I think you would take some time with some of those families who have lost loved ones to hear what some of these cases, what some of these individuals have done in the murdering of young children and others, and how they were given the death penalty, but the number of appeals that continue to go through and go through. Now, we want to make sure it's a humane way of doing it, and I think that's why the voters took up the last initiative. But the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, does not have the power just by himself saying he disagrees with it, because the voters have acted and the voters have spoken on this.
I want to move to the president's emergency declaration to fund his proposed border wall. Just yesterday, the Senate rejecting that declaration, along with the House. You voted to support the president's emergency action. And just moments ago from the Oval Office, the president said he plans to veto the move yesterday in the Senate and, of course, what happened in the House. Is this the right call, Congressman, for the president to bypass Congress, who, by the way, controls the power of the purse, and essentially let the president have unyielding spending power in this situation?
You're right. The Constitution says Article 1, the power of the purse happens with the Congress. But the one thing Congress did in 1976, it provided the president an ability for an emergency declaration to go through. Now, this is not the only president to use it. This has been used 60 times. So the first question you have, is there constitutional authority for the president to declare and utilize this money? Well, the first answer is yes. So if you disagree with the ability for the president to use it, you'd have to change a new law. And what was interesting with some of the senators, they were wanting to change the law, which was building right into the argument of the president that he has the authority to do it. Now, the second question would be, is there an emergency along the border? You and I both know of what happens with human trafficking, and we know where much of that comes from along the southern border. Just last month alone, 70-some thousand people were stopped illegally coming across the border. That's a high from more than a decade at any given time. So we know the amount of drugs. You know the challenge that we have here from the number of deaths from opioid, from fentanyl and others, and what comes across the southern border. I do believe if you've never traveled or spent some time along the border, if you spent one day down there, you would come to the conclusion too that we have an emergency. And what's very interesting, back a number of years ago, when the federal government did not act, there were two governors who called an emergency. One was Napolitano out of Arizona, who then went on to become DHS secretary. And then you had Richardson of New Mexico. And they declared an emergency in their own state along the southern border because the federal government was not acting. And they said the amount of drugs that was coming across, the amount of illegal people who were coming across, made their state unsafe. So they went as far as declaring an emergency as well. So yes, there is an emergency along the border, and yes, the president has the authority to do it. The Senate passed it, the president vetoed it, so now, as it says, it'll come back to the House, and I will vote to sustain, to help the president, that he is not overridden in the veto, and I believe we will be successful, and it will die there.
Well, the critics of this obviously talk about the scenario that if a Democrat was in the Oval Office and decided to declare a national emergency, say over climate change or an issue that was present in that administration, would you vote along the same principles, along the same precedent, to allow another president to have the same sort of power to declare a national emergency in that situation?
Well, I'd first look at, regardless who the president is, does the president have the constitutional authority to do it? But you know what? You can answer that question very easily, because President Obama did declare emergencies along, and never once did I move a bill that said no to take it back. So the answer is, I looked at both sides, and when he has the authority to do it, yes, even if it's a Democrat, I stood with what the Constitution says.
I want to move on to Valley fever, obviously an issue you've championed for years here in Kern County, and an issue you've brought to the nation's capital and getting national attention for. You held a Valley fever roundtable this, I believe, a week ago. Your co-chair of the Valley fever task force was saying researchers now 3 to 5 some years away from possibly developing a vaccine for animals. Does that mean we're getting closer to a vaccine for humans? What came away from that roundtable in Washington?
Well, this is a continuation of we have done before, and this was Congressman David Schweikert. And we created our own Valley Fever Caucus because most of the Valley Fever cases happen within both our districts from Arizona and California. But a number of years ago, when I first became a member of Congress, I had a Valley Fever Symposium here in Kern County, one of the first that we've been able to do. I brought the head of the NIH and the CDC. Francis Collins is still ahead of the NIH. Since that time, they have provided I believe it's about $6 million, where they're having an observational study going right now here in Kern County and in Arizona as well. And Dr. Royce Johnson over at the KMC is heading that up. And what they're doing is they're finding what is the best way to treat valley fever. And secondly, we're working towards a vaccine. And there is some promising movement that's happening. The number one thing that has to happen, though, is awareness. And all those three elements were the key elements of why we had the symposium. We had a number of people in, Russell Judd and others, from around the country here in Washington, D.C. And I want to continue the strength of where we've been moving now to the next future.
All right, and finally today, just saw you posted to your Facebook page, you were touring with the Sikh community today, out serving a meal and touring one of the businesses. That visit, though, comes on the heels of, I'm sure you've been following it, one of just a heartbreaking case of suspected murder of a newborn baby. There's been a lot of coverage around that community. They've really banded together in the midst of this tragedy. What did you glean from that? And how is the Sikh community doing today? And being out there serving with them, what was the mood like? Well,
when I toured today, and it was with also Mayor Karen Go, who does a tremendous job reaching all communities within Bakersfield. We toured a new business going in. It's a new gas station, and it has some Indian cuisine. It's going to have some chicken as well, and it also has for the trucks to come in and for their gas and fuel and others. And then we went down, and this is something people should all understand what the Sikh community does each and every year. But for the next 30 days, they have a facility that they open up right across from this studio, Mill Creek Park, where they give free lunches, mainly to the homeless down there, and feed them. And it's a part of their religion, it's a part of their culture to give back. And I try to work very closely in this Sikh community. And that's what part of the tour was today with Mayor Karen Go.
All right, Congressman Kevin McCarthy, we appreciate your time here and what you did today out there volunteering, giving your time. As we always say, we wish you luck in Washington, and thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.